Okay, so I would argue what we just got was 4 calls to action, all with slightly different perspectives, all with slightly different angles on it, but nonetheless calls to action all the same, and enthusiastic, passionate ones. So thank you to each of our panelists for that. As I mentioned, I'm getting lots of questions already, so pile them up and I will try and read as we go. But maybe I'll just start with one of my own questions to start with. And Jim, I think there's a microphone there. I don't know if there's more than one. You guys can maybe pass them around a little bit. My question really comes down to, if I sort of pick up a theme, one of the themes coming across is, I'll call it shortages. Whether it's shortages in feedstock, shortages in talent, shortages in capital, shortages in desire. I was wondering, picking one of those or more of those or tying those together, if you mind talking to us a little bit about where you see the biggest element of those shortages, and probably most importantly, maybe one idea of how we start to address some of those shortages. I don't know if, Jim, you want to get us started?
Sure. Can you hear? Great. As you saw on my slide, and I think actually the TorchLight presentation, the constraint is supply. It's not a demand problem. I don't think it's actually a price problem. I don't think it's a capital problem. I do think that we are deploying a lot of technologies that do not have, we're kind of deploying the wrong technology. SAF is expensive, and SAF takes a long time to build the plants because of the type of plants we're building. We're building the wrong plants. So the reason we're building the wrong plants is because we're using the wrong feedstock. We're not targeting the larger opportunity. It'd be the same thing if you tried to get a message by Pony Express to Vancouver. It'd take you a long time, be very expensive, right? So, we just need to think a little bit differently, and we need to double down on unlocking feedstock. The point about the timber resource that we just heard is correct. It's an artificial constraint because of the way we're thinking. We're going to change our thinking. So that would be my answer. It's a supply problem, it's a feedstock problem, and values change habits, or values change habits, habits change actions, actions change the world. So if you want to change the world, start with values. We've got the wrong values about how we're protecting the forest.
Maybe I go next.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say, our space of really creating this budding ecosystem of companies that are coming up with these really groundbreaking new technologies that lead to sustainability. The big gap is space for them to go, laboratory space and scale-up opportunity. There's a shortage of bioreactors, and for example, in the fish space, we had a speaker earlier this year, and he impressed on the audience if he was able to use all of the bioreactor capacity that's available around the world, he could produce 1% of the fish demand. So we need really infrastructure, and that infrastructure is elsewhere, it's not in Canada. That's the one big thing. I think the other big thing is capital. We get them started with small amounts of money, but when they then start growing and they're looking for the $2 to $5 million investment, that we have a huge gap in that in Canada. And so they can't grow here. They go to the US, they go to Europe, they go to incubators, and then it's hard to bring them back.
That's great.
Was it on? Okay. I guess I'd just like to build off the comment on the feedstocks. And, it is, SAF, like I said, is less than 1% of jet fuel. It's enabling markets that support a wide range of those feedstocks, creating competitive markets that can allow a diversity in other feedstocks to flourish through creating the greatest amount of decarbonization for the lowest value. And that's how you can diversify what that looks like, and it makes more economic sense. So SAF is expensive. I think that is a limit, but we can work through that with increasing efficiency in those market systems.
Super.
I'd say that the thing that's missing is political and policy bravery. I mean, I understand it's a difficult message to say, yeah, we're going to cut down more trees. I mean, it contradicts a lot of what we believe, but we have to look at the facts and the reality of what works and what doesn't work. You know, eventually the Prime Minister is going to be getting calls from the President being like, hey, why are you making our city smoky every year? Do something. And that requires an honest discussion with Canadians about our role as humans in a boreal forest and what we can and can't do.
That's great, thanks. Just sort of picking up on a bit of that then, I got a couple of questions here that kind of get at the economics of this. So I think each of you probably have a good, one in particular here talks about $20 trillion for the bioeconomy versus $30 trillion of debt. How do we grow sustainably? And so I think regardless of the numbers, I think for a lot of people, the question is, where do the economics start to come together? How do we, and to a certain extent, Jamie, maybe it's a question of political will and political interest and prioritization, but wouldn't mind each of your thoughts on the economics and where the economics of this start to come together, particularly at a time period where governments around the world are starting to look at the fiscal realities of coming out of a COVID period where significant investments were made, and now looking at the investments required in other priority areas.
So I can go on the forest side to actually do these types of operations and go in and thin the forest, reduce wildfire risk. You can't only look at what is the microeconomic cost of doing that. What is the cost of not doing something? What is the impact in air quality and healthcare? What is the impact on tourism? What is the impact on, you know, in BC, wine quality? All these things, what is the cost of having to evacuate people constantly? These are major costs. And again, this is a public asset, and the public owner is not taking care of it. And so it cannot be seen as a, oh, well, it's too expensive to do this types of operations. You know, it would just be unacceptable if it was private land and you had all these wildfires creating air pollution for everybody. And you cannot blame it all on climate either. So that's what I'd say is it's a consideration of not just the microeconomics. What does it mean for the country as a whole?
That's fair. Jim?
Let me just add in some economics, because that was the question. That's a good start. Let's begin with what we're using for SAF right now. We're using soybean oil. That's 70 cents a pound. Now, it takes 8 pounds of oil to make a gallon, so I'm doing this in imperial gallons, so you have to convert it into liters. But you're starting at $5.60 just for the feedstock. It's unacceptable to use $5.60 worth of soybean oil to make a $3 fuel, right? It's just not going to work. Now, you can do carbon credits all you want forever, but we need to get the price down. Now, let's look at the price of other biomass resources. The billion-ton study that was done by the U.S. Department of Energy projected 1 billion tons available at $60 a ton if you use the different feedstocks. $60 a ton, that's 3 cents a pound. We're using the 70-cent feedstock instead of the 3-cent feedstock. That's our problem.
Okay, anybody else want to jump in on the economics? All right, let's keep going, because I've got a lot of questions and I'm never going to get to all of them, so my apologies first to everybody here. But question for Bettina. You talked a lot about skills. What are the skills that we're missing in agrobiotech the most?
Missing primarily is on the scaling up on the biomanufacturing side of the skill sets. So that's really where it is. We have very few biomanufacturing engineers in Canada, and those are the programs we need to really strengthen. And I want to just highlight that there is an organization that's called CASL that is starting to do that on the medical side, which is really important, but we really don't have focused training programs on biomanufacturing in the ag and food space. We also don't have the programs in universities, because that space requires a lot of interdisciplinary interactions. You have to have the biology, the engineering, the mathematics, the computer science, the AI. All of these skills need to come together, and we don't have these kind of joint training grounds in Canada.
That's great. Anybody else, any thoughts on the talent side of the equation?
I would say particularly in forestry, it's extremely difficult. Timber harvest, as I mentioned, is down by about a third, probably about 40% now. You've seen about 150,000 job losses in the forest product sector. I mean, who wants to come into that? I mean, a lot of rural communities have really been left behind over the past decade, I would say, and the forestry communities are definitely in that group. So it is challenging. There are some emerging things like remotely operated harvesting equipment. They've even got drones that can actually avoid having to build roads and do some thinnings. It's still quite early stage, but so I think some of that comes into it, but ultimately getting people into what has historically been an economically challenging sector over the last 20 years, it is difficult to get people to see that as a job priority.
Fair. Yeah, please, Bettina. Yeah, please.
Make one more comment, and that is that in the agricultural space, the farming community really has trouble keeping and recruiting folks who want to be farmers. And being a farmer has sort of a certain vision associated with it, which is kind of hard labor, and it's outdoors, and it's running these big farms. But farming is becoming so high tech. It's really an area where people can apply so many different skill sets. And I visited a greenhouse last week. It's incredible, the tech that's involved there. So it's talking more about how attractive that is as a working ground. It's robotics. And by the way, we're using CO2 specifically to make our plants grow in greenhouses. So here's another use of CO2.
That's great. Thank you. So Jim, this one starts with you, but I suspect others will be interested in commenting too. Question around the revenue streams that you showed for renewable diesel and being contingent on U.S. and specifically California credits and incentives. And what do you see as the opportunity for Canadian policymakers to provide similar incentives in Canada to manage the cost challenge?
Well, Canada has a clean fuel standard that it's deploying right now. So British Columbia has a low carbon fuel standard. All you have to do is replicate what works, and we already know what works. And those kinds of economics that you saw on the chart there are California, but the same kind of prices exist for carbon credits for the low carbon fuel standard in British Columbia. The piece that doesn't exist in Canada, and this is an opportunity, is a tax credit, an investment tax credit that is matched to the tenor of the loan. So what you need to do is get a 20-year offtake, but you need a 20-year tax credit as well, because that's what's going to get plants financed. Right now, it's at the 80% of the time it takes to build a plant is the financing. We've got to get that down. We need to build 100 biorefineries a year. We're building about a handful. And the reason is because it's taking too long to finance them. So we've got to squeeze that down. So we need an investment tax credit that is matched to the tenor of the loan. 20-year loan needs a 20-year tax credit and a 20-year offtake agreement. We finally have 20-year offtake agreements. The very first one was signed last week by Southwest Airlines, a real visionary piece of work there. A lot more of other things happen, but if you get those three things, you'll get biorefineries built in, the financing will come together in weeks or months, not years.
Anybody else on the incentive subsidy conversation? Yeah, nice. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think with the incentive side, it's important to be able to stack those. So there's incentives for the producers, but again, it's like taking a cost and splitting it up across the entire stakeholder chain. And so the ability for the operators who are purchasing that to use that under incentives or their ESG reporting, and how does that done and what do those look like, should be considered when they're being developed. So that way there's a kind of an incentive or cost share for each piece through the entire chain of custody, not just the producers, the operators, and then ultimately how that gets passed on to Scope 3.
Thanks. Jamie, go ahead.
I'd just say some of the policies that we have, they're supposed to be technology neutral, but they are written in such a way that it takes you down a certain pathway of production, and compliance is only permitted through certain pathways. So for instance, clean fuel regulations, carbon dioxide removals are not at a separate facility are not permitted under that. There's a removal occurring. Why can that not be used? Clean electricity regulations. One of the big problems with that, again, you're trying to regulate on a plant-by-plant basis, not recognizing how the electricity grid actually operates, and again, not permitting carbon dioxide removals. We need a little bit more imagination in some of this policy making, and instead of having a bunch of opaque costing in terms of what compliance costs and $400, $500, $600 a ton for compliance. I mean, there are limits to what we're going to be able to accomplish if that is the implied cost of doing it. And yes, you can get your 5 or 10% blend rate, but you're not going to get elimination of those emissions. So, because eventually that implied cost will become too much on a per liter basis. So we always have to be thinking about what is the cost of actually accomplishing what we want to accomplish, which is to reduce the emissions.
Great. So a more specific question here from Madison. Somebody was particularly curious about traceability to SAF and how you can ensure traceability of SAF in the blend.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a little bit more my bread and butter. So that is exactly what CoSAFA is working on. How you trace that. We've written our initial set of guidelines that were out in May, and we're piloting in a public feedback period for them. But we've developed a unique ID that starts with the producer and changes through the chain of custody. So that way, it's used the same across all registries, across all fuels. It allows you to easily see what's in that fuel, what the decarbonization value is, and continue to split up into smaller batches. So that's what we've used with our product transfer document that allows easily demonstrating what claims were made, at what point, and then ultimately when that fuel is retired.
That's great. I'm trying to rapid fire my way through a few of these more specific ones. Jamie, I think this one's down for you because it's on BECCS. BECCS sounding very promising. Can you elaborate on the downside of BECCS? What's the roadblock?
So the challenge right now is monetization, right? And I think this also goes to fuel charge exemptions, everything like that. Ultimately, the more transparent things are, that can actually end up being the lower cost. But we're going in a way of opaque policies, so that consumers and the general public, the voters, i.e. voters, don't know what the actual cost is. Everybody says, yes, of course I want clean fuels. Well, duh. I mean, but who wants to pay a tax? So that's a communications thing. In terms of the monetization, basically there's 3 ways. There's the voluntary market. That currently is in its infancy. We've got Norway's going down a pathway of a reverse carbon tax. So basically you take funds from the carbon tax and pay for removals. That would work at a federal level. And then the other is what Sweden is doing, is essentially reverse auctions for carbon dioxide removals. So taking funds, again, from their carbon tax, but having a competitive process for purchase of those removals. And they've allocated about $4.5 billion for BECCS-specific carbon dioxide removals. So that is currently the challenge. IPCC, everybody says we need removals, but there has to be a monetization pathway that also provides that, as Jeff pointed out, that security, that policy, in terms of, yes, 15, 20 years from now, the price of carbon will be this, because ultimately we're taking hot air and putting it underground. So that only has value if policy says it has value.
All right, so we're down to our last minute here, so I'm going to ask each of you a quick fire one here, which is, for those who are here this morning, what's the one thing that they should take away this morning that they should be doing within their business, within their community, within their organization, coming out of this morning to make sure that we are actually taking this and turning this into action? So maybe we'll go in reverse order to where we started, and we'll start with Jamie down at the end.
I just say, in terms of affordability and finding the pathways that have actually been proven. I can talk about bioheat, but what's actually been proven, and not just listening to what the rhetoric is of what you should do.
Thanks. Madison?
Yeah, so I think, and mine's going to be very specific in terms of staff, but in terms of staff, understanding the broad environment, looking at it from a neutral stance on feedstock diversification, production process, how can we really get the greatest amount of decarbonization for the lowest value, and what support systems need to be in place to do that, and supporting those that are looking to take friction out of the process instead of add friction for their own monetary benefit.
Great. Bettina?
There's few things we do more often than eat. Our agricultural systems are not sustainable. So help us rally behind $7.5 billion, new economy, 86,000 jobs for Canadians, and what that requires is investment. BioCreate is a great tool. Come and talk to us about BioCreate. I will say that we had 100 companies come to us in the first round, and we were able to fund 12 companies. So funding is really, really critical, and partnerships as well, as I said. So come and talk to us how we can build that industry.
That's great. Last word to you, Jim.
I think it's all been said, but I haven't said it. So my turn. But all I would add is that you ought to recognize that in yourselves that you've got to work harder at this, and you've got to stop putting your hand out. You need a hand up, but the long-term carbon price should not be your goal. Your goal should be get the technology price down, and get the right feedstocks in use. If you work on that, everyone else will do their part, and the capital is already there. The reason the capital isn't here in this room is because you haven't worked harder on that. So you've got to work harder. We all have to work harder. So that would be my challenge for you.
Right. Well, for a conference that is called The Future Is Now, I think we couldn't have got a better panel to start us off. So if we could get a quick round of applause for our panel members.